a wonderful honor. Thank you very much for having me. When I first got the invitation, I did what any good Jewish boy does. I called my mother. And I said, "This is what I'm doing. Isn't this wonderful?" And she said, "You accepted an invitation to speak in Toronto in February." I said, "Yes." She said, "The difference between you and Einstein is that he was a genius." So, Albert Einstein. We love Albert Einstein. Everyone loves Albert Einstein. But Jews, we really love Albert Einstein. I give talks often to all sorts of audiences. And when I speak to a non-Jewish audience, I have to explain and say, look, if you're going to talk to Jews, you have to understand that before too long, you're going to hear a certain phrase that will just naturally come up. And that is, you know he's Jewish. It's like Jewish Jeopardy, right? You got to be the first person to ring in when a name comes up. But the one person we never, ever have to say, you know he's Jewish, is Einstein. And so one question that I set out to address in this first book is, what is it that makes Albert Einstein super Jew? Right? If you're going to talk about the world's most famous Jew, why is it Einstein? Now, it is absolutely true that Albert Einstein was a practicing, observant Jew when he was 9 years old. Then he turned 10. We'll tell that story in a minute. But the point is that Einstein is a physicist who happens to be Jewish. Unlike, say, Chaim Weizmann, who was a Jew who happened to be a chemist, right? In that way. So the question is, what is it about Einstein that makes him the world's most famous Jew? And the frame I wanted to put this in to explore it is a phrase, and it's the phrase that we have here, Einstein's Jewish science, or Einstein's Jewish physics, which is a phrase that comes from a man named Philip Lenard, who was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and one of Einstein's personal heroes, who later becomes the leader of the Aryan physics movement. And he is the one who calls Einstein's theory of relativity, which we will explain. I promise you will not leave this room today without understanding the theory of relativity. Okay, I do this for a living, so we'll get there. So here's a claim. Einstein's theory is Jewish science, which is meant to denigrate it, meant to draw a distinction between it and authentic science, real science, Aryan science. And so it's a phrase born in hatred. And the question is it possible in our love of Einstein to do with this phrase, Einstein's Jewish physics, what, say, the gay lesbian community has done with the term queer? Can we reappropriate it? Is there any way that we can think about what Einstein was doing and go, yeah, that was, in fact, Jewish science in some sense of the word? And will we need to reinterpret it? Yes. But we're Jews. That's what we do. So the question is, can we make the straightforward claim that Einstein's theory is Jewish science? Well, in the trivial sense, yes, it was science done by a Jew. Sort of. Was Einstein a Jew? All right, now that gets, of course, into the question of what makes someone a Jew. That's an entire semester's worth of conversation. He comes from a secular Jewish family, a family so secular, he was sent to Catholic school, Peter Schule, St. Peter's Academy, where he was the only Jewish boy. Now, if you are different and a little bit smart, you know what happens to you in elementary school. And Einstein was bullied. Now, it's interesting, he writes a number of autobiographical sketches, and memory is like this. It changes from one to the next. In some cases, he talks about physical bullying. He was beaten up. In other cases, it's just verbal. But we know that there was some bullying. And there's one particular episode he always remembers. It would be, I don't know, about a month and a half from now, around Easter time. And at the time, it was mandated by German law that religious education be a part of every educational structure. So in a Catholic school, he was in a class on the catechism. And so once a week, a priest would come in and give religious instruction. And so here was the only Jewish kid in there, and it's Easter. And so the priest walks in with 3 big, heavy metal nails and ceremoniously drops them on a table to a loud clatter and looks up at the class and says, "These are the sorts of nails that were used to crucify Jesus, our Lord." And every eye in the room turned to Einstein. So he was different. He was the Jewish kid. At school, at home, he was a grandchild of the Haskalah. He was raised in a very aggressively secular home. His father was a modernist, which is what many, many German Jews at the time were. Right? The idea being that modernism offered the opportunity for Jewish emancipation, right? That the fundamental aspect of Enlightenment thought is that to be human is to be rational, and all humans are rational, and this is where our concept of equality comes from. And so Jews were very quick in Europe to latch on to these ideas because they held for Jews the opportunity to have some sort of political equality. And so modernism was seen as important to the possibility of Jewish flourishing, which meant, and this is why certain people like Heschel had such a deep problem with it, who thought this is pulling us away from Judaism, but there was a large part of the Jewish community who thought this is the key for us. And that was Einstein's father. And so he grew up in not only a non-religious home, but a rabidly anti-religious home, where the old ways were seen as superstitions that we needed to get beyond in order to grow as a people. And so Einstein is, at school, the Jewish kid, at home, anti-Jewish. Now, Einstein had a personality. Anyone who has had more than one child knows this one, right? Kids just are who they are. You can shape them to some degree, but they are who they are. I have 2 kids. I have a son and a daughter. My daughter, who is in college right now, she's studying theater. My son is a high school junior. But when they were both very young, say 3 years old, if I would put on a record, I'll explain what that means to you guys, of a concert. At the end, there's always the applause. When my son was 3 years old, at the end of the record, he'd stand up and clap along. My daughter would stand up and take a bow. They're just different kids. They have different personalities. Einstein was like that. Einstein was just wired so that if you had authority, his thumb was going for your eye. Einstein just rankled under the authority of anyone who had power to tell him what to do, what to think. And so here's Einstein. At school, the Jewish kid. At home, it's anti-Jewish. So what does he do? Well, 2 birds with 1 stone. He becomes the Jewish kid. And at age 9, he starts keeping kosher, which is very hard to do in a German household where every meal features sausage. He starts making up little psalms to God that he sings to himself on the way to school. He becomes a Jew. And then he turns 10. What happens when he turns 10? Well, 2 things that alter his life forever. One, and this is the big one, the thing that really turns Einstein away from his Jewish identity is the reading of Talmud. Not the ancient rabbis, but Max Talmud, who was a medical student who would dine with the Einsteins once a week. It was a standard practice back then amongst German Jews that once a week you would take a college student in and feed them, because college students, then like now, didn't have a lot of money, could use a good home-cooked meal, and so the practice was once a week you let one sit at your table. Now, Max Talmud was a medical student, and the idea is if you want to get in good with the parents, what do? You make nice to the kid. And so he would pick up these inexpensive popular science paperbacks on his way over. He'd give them to Albert while the meal was being prepared or the dishes were being cleaned. Albert would just devour it, and then they would discuss. The one that made the biggest impact on him was a book on Euclidean geometry. Yeah, that's the response I usually get, right? Think about how geometry works, right? Euclid starts with 30 definitions, right? What do we mean by our basic geometric terms, right? So a point is that which has no part, right? Sort of like your hairstyle, right? I'm getting there, right? And definitions are true by definition, right? He then goes and gives 5 axioms. These are general mathematical claims, which again have to be true, right? So if he has a certain number of apples and she has the same number of apples, and then I give them equal number of additional apples, they still have the same number of apples as each other, right? Equals added to equals yields equals, right? Then he has his 5 postulates. And these are claims that are expressly geometric, right? So if I have 2 points, can I use a line to connect them? Yeah. How far can the line go in that direction? Far as you want. How about in this direction? Far as you want. If I have a point, can I draw a circle around it? How big? Big as you want, right? If I have a line and a point not on the line, how many lines can I draw through this point parallel to that line? One and only one, right? And these are just true. They're necessarily true. You can't deny them, right? I mean, if she said, well, why 1? Why not 3? We know how she is, right? The point is, she's just being difficult, right? It's obvious. So we start with these self-evident propositions and then using deductive logic, the logic that gives you absolute certainty. He goes and he derives 13 books full of theorems, absolutely, necessarily true. Einstein reads this and his mind is blown. Here in this book are all of these non-intuitive or counterintuitive truths about the nature of space, and all I need? Human reason. Human thought is enough to give me all of the truths of the nature of space itself. I don't need teachers. I don't need rabbis. I don't need a military. I don't need anyone with control to tell me. I can figure it out. The second thing that year is that he gets sick. Not very sick, just chicken soup sick. He's not feeling well, so his father, trying to cheer him up, shows him a compass. Now, interesting thing about a compass is that that dial points north no matter how you orient it. Einstein looks at that compass and says, what's doing the pulling? Where's the string? There isn't one. There is, we now have observable evidence for, invisible forces at work that affect observable systems. There are invisible forces at work in the universe. And pairing that with what we learned from geometry, I need only human reason to divine how they work. And so with these two things, at 10 years old, he decides, I don't need any authority to tell me what to believe. I will just reason about the truths of the universe. 10 years old. And he gives up his Jewish identity. And we know it sticks, and we know that for a good period after, including 1905, which we'll talk about when he comes up with the theory of relativity, he doesn't even consider himself a Jew. And we know this in a couple of ways. There's one letter from his high school, which he left Catholic school, went to a general high school. There were enough Jewish boys there. They had Jewish training. And so there's actually a letter from his Hebrew school teacher on his 50th birthday, wishing him a happy birthday. And he sends back a wonderful note saying, "It is so wonderful to hear from you. I'm just sorry I didn't pay attention at all in your class." So those who teach Hebrew school, nothing changes. The other is we know when he was going to get his first real job as a professor. It was at University in Prague. Gets to the border with his family. He's got to fill out paperwork. There's a line that says religion. He writes dissenter. The bureaucrat says, "That's not a religion. You're Jewish. You have to write Jewish." He says, "I'm not. I won't." He says, "You must. You will." He said, "I shan't." And then the bureaucrat played the one card he thought he had. "You don't write Jewish on that line, you don't get the job." Einstein said, "Fine," and turned around and started to walk out. This could have been his only possible job as a legitimate professor. He was an assistant back then, and that meant more than just rank. He was willing to give it all up just so that he didn't have to fill out on a form that no one would read that he was Jewish. Now, the story has a happy ending. The bureaucrat realizes he's about to lose Einstein for the country. This might not be good for his career. And so they negotiate a compromise. He will write in that slot, Mosaic. So I'm not Jewish, but I'm of the people of Moses. So we know that Einstein, at the time when he came up with the theory of relativity, did not have a sense of Jewish identity. How did it come back? That's my second book. Feel free to ask afterwards. But the point is that when he's writing relativity theory, we know, A, he doesn't consider himself Jewish, B, we know he doesn't have a background in Talmud, a background in halakhic thought. He's not a Jewish intellectual in the standard sense. So if we want to call it Jewish science in that way, we're just wrong. So is there another way? Is there some other way that we can reinterpret this phrase to give it some meaning, to justify our love of Einstein as Jews? This all started when a colleague of mine, Stephen Stern, who's the head of Judaic Studies at Gettysburg College, came into my office and he started fetching. He's a trained philosopher, and he said, when we teach ethics, what we're really teaching is Christian ethics, right? Because we all teach it the same way, right? We teach the different systems. We teach Aristotle's virtue ethics. We teach Kant's deontology. We teach Mill and Bentham's utilitarianism. And then we ask, which one is the right one? The right one. It's like, that is such a Christian approach. He says, Jewish ethics is all about dialogue, right? It's all about approaching these questions from a general point of view to a specific context and then looking at it from multiple sides, right? When you see how rabbis are trained, right? They're trained in pairs, right? Chavarim, you always have a partner. And the idea is one takes one side of the argument, the other takes the other side, and you argue as hard as you can, and then you switch. The idea is that there is an absolute truth, right? There is God's truth. It's not relativism, but that any one human perspective the truth is too big to fit into any one human perspective. The human perspective is too small to contain the full truth. And as he's saying all of this, a thought pops into my mind. I said, that's how Einstein argues in physics. And then the strangest thing happened. He stopped talking. If you knew him, that's funny. And we both had the same idea at the same time. He didn't have tenure. This is a paper. And so the idea was this, is there, and we're not making a causal claim, but is there at least a way to talk about the style of Einstein's thought that is very much connected with the style of standard Talmudic thought? And so we started thinking, and what's interesting, and most people don't realize this, is that scientists have styles, right? You might listen to a piece of music you've never heard before but realize, okay, that's Bach. You may look at a painting you've never seen before and think, that must be a Picasso. But it's odd for most people to realize you can read an article and realize, oh, I see what he's doing. That's very Einstein. Einstein does have a style. There's a standard move he uses over and over again, which is really, really interesting. Here's the part where we're going to explain relativity theory. So, two simple concepts if you want to understand the theory of relativity. Covariance and invariance. So, simple question, is the pen to the left or right of my hand? And you will say, serves me right asking a simple question to a room full of Jews. Simple question. Is the pen to the left or right of my hand? You will say, simple question. Thank you. You will say to the left, I will say to the right. Well, we disagree. Which one of us is right? The answer is yes. Doesn't mean that it's random, doesn't mean that it's subjective, right? I mean, if she says, I think the pen is to the right, she is wrong, right? Left is the one with the L, right? There is a fact of the matter. Once you nail down a perspective, once you have a frame of reference, once you have a point from which you're looking, there is a fact of the matter as to whether the pen is to the left or the right. But if you change the perspective, if you change the frame of reference, that fact can change. That's what we call a covariant fact. That is, it changes with perspective, right? Similarly, we have this question. True or false? The pen is between the hands. True, and that's true no matter where you're looking from, right? This is what we call an invariant truth. It does not vary with your perspective. Now, we find invariant truths in physics to be really, really important, right? If a truth is invariant, if it doesn't depend at all on your perspective, that means it's probably true of the underlying universe, right? So we want to know what truths in the world are invariant, right? And that's not very different from the way we normally think, right? I mean, suppose she tells me something. Am I going to believe it? She's laughing. Okay, we know. But now he tells me, and I know those two aren't talking, not after last Pesach and that thing we won't talk about, right? But then I know she tells me the same thing, and she doesn't even know them. Now what am I thinking? They saw it on Facebook, right? The idea is if I'm hearing it from independent sources, it's probably true. In the same way, if the truth is independent of the reference frame, it's probably true of the underlying furniture of the universe. So the question is, what truths are invariant and what truths are covariant? What Einstein's theory does is take certain things that we thought were here and turns them into here, right? So, simple question. How long do you think that pen is? 5 inches. I thought you'd use the metric system. I left the States.
I lived in the States.
So if the pen is 5 inches now, how long is it now? 5 inches. It's just 5 inches moving across the floor, right? We think length is invariant. That's what Isaac Newton said. Einstein realized, no, if I were moving at 3/4 the speed of light across the floor here, you would measure this pen now at 3.5 inches. I, because it's moving with me, would still measure it at 5. Which one of us is right? Is the pen really 5 or 3.5 inches? Turns out that length is covariant. It's not a part of the world. And it's not just length, right? If we were to synchronize our watches, and I love this side of the room because we have watches. Over there, they pull out their phones. So if we synchronize watches, so that 1 second on her watch is 1 second on my watch, then those watches ought to be synchronized, whether I'm still or moving or in the opening scene of West Side Story, right? The point is time. Time should not matter. But if I was moving at 3/4 the speed of light across the front of this room, you would hear my watch slow down. I would be hearing it keeping perfect time. Well, which one of us is right? Is my watch slow or is it keeping time? Turns out that duration is covariant. We thought, following Newton, it was invariant. Einstein says no, covariant. And it's not just time and distance. It's also mass. Faster you go, the heavier you get, which is not reason to tell your doctor you're not going to work out on the treadmill. This is the reason why you can't go faster than the speed of light. It's not an engineering problem. It's not that we haven't figured it out. You can't. And the way I'll do it in the classroom is usually this. I'll take a chair, I'll push it, and I'll say, okay, what happened? Well, you pushed the chair and it moved. Right. I gave it a force and it acquired an acceleration. So, okay, what happens if we add mass? And I'll take usually a slight young lady and I'll put her in the chair. I'll say, if I want the same acceleration, what do I need? More force. And I'll slide her across the floor. Then we set it back and I get a hefty gentleman, usually a football player, and I sit him down right on her lap to the hilarity of everyone. Say, okay, if I want the same acceleration, what do I need? More force. And I'm not going to do that because that gives me a hernia. But the point is, as the chair gets heavier, I need more force to accelerate it. What Einstein shows is the faster you go, the heavier you get. As you approach the speed of light, the weight of the chair approaches infinity. And if it were infinitely heavy, how much force would I need to accelerate it even a tiny little bit? An infinite amount of force, which requires infinite energy. You're not going to get that. That's why you can't go faster than the speed of light. It's not that we haven't figured out how. It's that if this theory is right, it is physically impossible. So the idea here is this is the theory. And in the paper that starts it all, on the electrodynamics of moving bodies, Einstein does what he often does. Einstein works pictorially. Einstein always starts with a picture. And for him, it's this. Suppose I have a coil of wire and a magnet. And I move the magnet through the coil. What happens? I generate a current, right? Why? Well, according to Maxwell's laws, by moving the magnet, I have a dynamic magnetic field, which gives rise ultimately to the current. Now, what happens if I hold the magnet still and move the coil over it? Same thing. But Maxwell's equations give us a different explanation because I have a static magnetic field because the magnet isn't moving. Einstein says, wait a minute, two situations with different physical explanations, yet the same effect. They are the same. There is a larger truth that we need to explain in terms of different perspectives, and he gives us the transformation equations that shows that there is a larger truth which is only explainable to humans in terms of our different perspectives. Where have we seen that before? Same thing happens in 1916. His generalization of it, which is why we call it the general theory of relativity, comes again from an image. It is what he called his happiest thought. What is Einstein's happiest thought? He's at work. At this point, he's still a patent clerk. He's looking out the window, third story, of a person cleaning windows. And he thinks, what happens if he falls off that ladder? That is Einstein's happiest thought. For most of us, that's a horrible thought, because what do we think? He's going to break his leg, he's going to break his neck, he's going to die. Because we think of him landing. Einstein's not thinking of the landing, Einstein's thinking of the falling. What happens when he's falling? The answer is he won't feel his weight. Right? The way we'll often do this now is, suppose you're in an elevator, 36-story building. You get in the elevator with a bathroom scale. Well, you have an eating disorder, you're going to see your psychiatrist, right? And you get on the scale, what does it read? A little too much, right? But it reads your weight. Now you hit the button. As the elevator starts going up, what does the scale read? More. Why? Well, the way it normally works is the floor is here, the scale is here, you step on it, the springs squish, right? But once the floor starts going up, you're still pushing down the same, but now the floor is pushing up, so there's more squish in the spring, so the weight goes up. But then as you get to the 36th floor, the unthinkable happens. The cable snaps, and in your last seconds hurtling down the shaft, you look down at the scale, what's it reading? 0. Why? Well, you're still pushing down, but the floor is falling away at the same rate, and so there's no squish in the spring. Indeed. For those of us carrying a little extra weight, it is a fine way to die. Right? Now, let's change the situation. Suppose you're in a rocket, out in the middle of empty space, not near any mass. What do you weigh? Nothing, right? This is the one and only one purpose for manned spacecraft. This is it, because it's really cool to be able to take your pen, put it there, and have it stay. There's nothing we can do in space that we can't do better with robots. It's just cool to take your tang and make a line and have it float. Right? Now, you step on your scale, it reads 0. Suppose you fire the engines, and the rocket starts accelerating upward at 32 feet per second, or 9.8 meters per second for you smart people up here. Now what does the scale read? The same as it would read on Earth. Exactly. So, Einstein asked a question. You wake up tomorrow. You just find yourself in a small metal room with a bathroom scale. Can you tell whether you are at rest on Earth in a gravitational field, or whether you're accelerating where there's no gravitation? No. Right? And if it reads 0, are you in free fall in the Earth's gravitational field? Or are you at rest in outer space? You can't tell. There is no way to tell. He says, principle of equivalence. Inertia, gravitation, can't tell the difference. There is no difference. That is, there is one truth that we see differently depending on our human context. Again, what do we see? That same exact move, right? There is God's truth. There is an absolute truth. But we, as human beings, only see the world from a particular context, and so with each context, what we're going to see is a different aspect of that truth. What do you read in Talmud? The same exact thing, right? Well, thou shalt not steal. You're at a shopping mall. Christmas Eve. You find 20 bucks in the middle of the parking lot. Is it yours? Is it stealing to pick it up and put it in your pocket? The rabbis say, no, because you can't identify who the owner was. It's Christmas Day. You're over at, your Goyish friend's house. You find 20 bucks on her floor. Can you pick it up and put it in your pocket? No, right? What's the difference? There's still an absolute truth, right? Thou shalt not steal. But contextually, we need to understand it differently, right? Same sort of move. And so what Stephen and I argued is that in this way, what we can see is through the style of Einstein's thought, that there is a way in which it mirrors the sort of thinking Jews tend to do. Now, again, we don't want to make the causal claim. We're not saying that Einstein studied Talmud and that's why, or maybe it was in the air in the community in which he was born, and so he, somehow by osmosis, or in this case, osmosis, right, that he somehow took it out. The causal, I don't know why, we don't know how, but isn't it odd how much his style looks like this other style of thinking? And so stylistically, at least, I think we can say there is some way in which we can say that Einstein's science is Jewish science, at least in this Jewish sense. Now, are there non-Jews who think this way? Absolutely, right? If you look, for example, at feminist epistemologists, standpoint theory, very much a similar sort of approach, right? If you look at the African philosopher Emmanuel Easy, he makes a similar move with respect to African thought. So it's clearly not, and you don't see it in every Jewish thinker. You know, Freud, for example, there is, right, so you've got, you know, the patient, and you've got the psychoanalyst. The psychoanalyst is always right, does see into the psyche, right? There are ways when he tells me about his childhood and his dreams, I am able to see within the subconscious the problems that do lie there. And so in that way, you can think of Freud doesn't. He's not Jewish in this way, even though if you look biographically, there are striking similarities between the lives of Freud and Einstein, right? So we don't want to claim that all Jewish scientists think this way. And there are certainly non-Jewish scientists who also do. But this sense of Jewishness, this idea of there being an absolute truth, but looking through contexts to see how it differs in different perspectives, is one that I think Einstein would have appreciated, right? When you look at the writings of W.E.B. Du Bois, the early sociologist, one of the things he talks about is the double consciousness of minorities, right? And Jews are everywhere. And before the founding of the modern state of Israel, right, we were generally minorities everywhere. And when you're an outsider, you do see the world differently, right? It was mentioned that my latest book is on philosophy of humor. Now, jokes are a really interesting phenomenon. How do jokes work, right? Knock, knock. To. No, to whom? Right? The way that joke works is you have a setup that leads you to think in one direction and a punchline that makes you realize, oh, I needed to be thinking differently, right? How do you think of jokes? Well, what's interesting is if you look at the history of comedy, there are a disproportionate number of minorities who are comedians. Why? Well, I think Du Bois gives us the answer. If you are a member of a minority in a majority group, right, you have to learn to speak their language. You have to, in order to be able to get along, see the world as they see it, but you're also the outsider, and so you have this double consciousness. And if you're already going through life, seeing life in multiple ways, it's very easy to make these jokes that require what? Seeing the world in multiple ways. And Einstein, throughout his life, really describes himself as the outsider, right? The term he uses is Einspanner, a lone horse, right? He's that oddball. And so the idea that somehow being the oddball is what gives rise to insight, I think it's something he would appreciate. And with that, I'll say thank you and take any questions you might have.